He was 8 years old the first time she told him he'd never amount to anything, and 24 years later, she found out exactly who he'd become, in her own hearing, in front of her own lawyer, from her own mouth. Before we get into it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe, because next week I've got 2 more stories lined up that I promise you will not want to miss. Now, let's get into it. Columbus, Ohio doesn't announce itself the way some cities do. It doesn't have a skyline that ends up on postcards. What it has is government buildings, squat, serious, brick and limestone structures built in an era when people believed institutions should look permanent. Franklin County Family Court sits 3 blocks from a state house, in a building that's seen every version of a family fall apart and try to put itself back together. Custody battles, license revocations, guardianship disputes. It's not a place people choose to be. It's a place people end up. On the 3rd floor, Courtroom 4B gets afternoon light through windows that haven't been washed since the last administration. The light falls in long gold bars across rows of wooden benches worn smooth by 2 generations of nervous hands. There's a state seal behind the bench, its gold paint chipped at the edges, the way institutional symbols get chipped when nobody budgets for their upkeep. Along the side wall, bankers' boxes are stacked 3 high, case files that never made it into the digital system because the county ran out of storage money 4 years ago, and nobody's fixed it since. It's an unremarkable room. That's the whole point. Nothing that happens in a room like this is supposed to be historic. It's supposed to be Tuesday. Judge Marcus Webb had been on the bench in 4B for 11 months. 32 years old, young for a family court judge, which people noticed, though they were usually too polite to say so directly. He wore his robe like it weighed nothing. He moved like a man who had learned a long time ago that stillness was its own kind of armor. When lawyers approached the bench, they noticed he didn't lean forward to meet their energy. He waited. He let them come all the way to him. He had asked for this docket rotation. Not loudly, not through any channel that would draw attention. Just a quiet request to the court administrator 3 months back, framed as routine scheduling flexibility. Nobody questioned it. Judges requested docket adjustments all the time. What nobody in that building knew, not his clerk, not the bailiff, not the county's chief judge who'd mentored him since law school, was that Marcus Webb had spent 6 years of his childhood as a case file. Case number FC 118834. Foster placement, Franklin County. Opened when he was 7, closed when he was 14, filed under closed. No further action required. He remembered the file number the way some people remember their childhood phone number. It had been carved into him. And today that file's author, the woman who had once been his legal guardian, the woman whose name was stamped across 6 years of his life, was walking into his courtroom for her foster care license renewal hearing, with absolutely no idea who was sitting behind the bench. Diane Holloway arrived 20 minutes early, the way she always did. She believed punctuality was a kind of virtue, one of the many small disciplines she liked to remind people she practiced. 58 years old, silver blonde hair set in the same style she'd worn for a decade, a cardigan the color of oatmeal, a leather folio tucked under one arm like a shield. She had a way of entering a room that suggested she expected to be recognized. And in Groveport, the quiet suburb 15 minutes southeast of Columbus, where she'd lived her whole adult life, she usually was. 11 children, she liked to say, at church potlucks, at the ribbon cutting for her nonprofit's new training center, at the county's annual Foster Parent Appreciation Dinner, where she'd been given a plaque 3 years running. I've fostered 11 children. I know how this works better than anyone in that building. Holloway Family Futures, her nonprofit, trained new foster parents across 3 counties. State contract, steady funding, a name that appeared in local news pieces about model foster families, with a regularity that had stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like a brand. She had built something. She believed, sincerely, that what she had built was good. Her lawyer, a mild, unremarkable man named Grant Pilcher, met her outside for B with a manila folder and a tight smile. "Should be quick," he said. "Renewal's basically a formality at this point. You've done this 3 times before." Diane nodded like a woman confirming something she already knew. "It's always a formality," she said. until someone in that room decides to make it about something else. She said it like a joke. It wouldn't be one. Angela Torres was already seated at the caseworker's table when they walked in, files stacked in front of her in the particular disorganized order of someone who'd been assigned too many cases and given too little time to prepare for any of them properly. 41, tired in the specific way of people who'd chosen a helping profession and then spent 2 decades discovering how much of that help got swallowed by paperwork. She'd reviewed Diane Halloway's file for renewal 3 times now. He was 8 years old the first time she told him he'd never amount to anything, and 24 years later, she found out exactly who he'd become, in her own hearing, in front of her own lawyer, from her own mouth. Before we get into it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe, because next week I've got 2 more stories lined up that I promise you will not want to miss. Now, let's get into it. Columbus, Ohio doesn't announce itself the way some cities do. It doesn't have a skyline that ends up on postcards. What it has is government buildings, squat, serious, brick and limestone structures built in an era when people believed institutions should look permanent. Franklin County Family Court sits 3 blocks from a state house, in a building that's seen every version of a family fall apart and try to put itself back together. Custody battles, license revocations, guardianship disputes. It's not a place people choose to be. It's a place people end up. On the 3rd floor, Courtroom 4B gets afternoon light through windows that haven't been washed since the last administration. The light falls in long gold bars across rows of wooden benches worn smooth by 2 generations of nervous hands. There's a state seal behind the bench, its gold paint chipped at the edges, the way institutional symbols get chipped when nobody budgets for their upkeep. Along the side wall, bankers' boxes are stacked 3 high, case files that never made it into the digital system because the county ran out of storage money 4 years ago, and nobody's fixed it since. It's an unremarkable room. That's the whole point. Nothing that happens in a room like this is supposed to be historic. It's supposed to be Tuesday. Judge Marcus Webb had been on the bench in 4B for 11 months. 32 years old, young for a family court judge, which people noticed, though they were usually too polite to say so directly. He wore his robe like it weighed nothing. He moved like a man who had learned a long time ago that stillness was its own kind of armor. When lawyers approached the bench, they noticed he didn't lean forward to meet their energy. He waited. He let them come all the way to him. He had asked for this docket rotation. Not loudly, not through any channel that would draw attention. Just a quiet request to the court administrator 3 months back, framed as routine scheduling flexibility. Nobody questioned it. Judges requested docket adjustments all the time. What nobody in that building knew, not his clerk, not the bailiff, not the county's chief judge who'd mentored him since law school, was that Marcus Webb had spent 6 years of his childhood as a case file. Case number FC 118834. Foster placement, Franklin County. Opened when he was 7, closed when he was 14, filed under closed. No further action required. He remembered the file number the way some people remember their childhood phone number. It had been carved into him. And today that file's author, the woman who had once been his legal guardian, the woman whose name was stamped across 6 years of his life, was walking into his courtroom for her foster care license renewal hearing, with absolutely no idea who was sitting behind the bench. Diane Halloway arrived 20 minutes early, the way she always did. She believed punctuality was a kind of virtue, one of the many small disciplines she liked to remind people she practiced. 58 years old, silver blonde hair set in the same style she'd worn for a decade, a cardigan the color of oatmeal, a leather folio tucked under one arm like a shield. She had a way of entering a room that suggested she expected to be recognized. And in Groveport, the quiet suburb 15 minutes southeast of Columbus, where she'd lived her whole adult life, she usually was. 11 children, she liked to say, at church potlucks, at the ribbon cutting for her nonprofit's new training center, at the county's annual foster parent appreciation dinner, where she'd been given a plaque 3 years running. I've fostered 11 children. I know how this works better than anyone in that building. Halloway Family Futures, her nonprofit, trained new foster parents across 3 counties. State contract, steady funding, a name that appeared in local news pieces about model foster families, with a regularity that had stopped feeling like coincidence and started feeling like a brand. She had built something. She believed, sincerely, that what she had built was good. Her lawyer, a mild, unremarkable man named Grant Pilcher, met her outside for B with a manila folder and a tight smile. "Should be quick," he said. "Renewal's basically a formality at this point. You've done this 3 times before." Diane nodded like a woman confirming something she already knew. "It's always a formality," she said, "until someone in that room decides to make it about something else." She said it like a joke. It wouldn't be one. Angela Torres was already seated at the caseworkers' table when they walked in, files stacked in front of her in the particular disorganized order of someone who'd been assigned too many cases and given too little time to prepare for any of them properly. 41, tired in the specific way of people who'd chosen a helping profession and then spent 2 decades discovering how much of that help got swallowed by paperwork. She'd reviewed Diane Halloway's file for renewal 3 times now. Diane Halloway had told the story so many times it had the smooth, worn quality of a stone handle for years. She told it now the way she told it at fundraising dinners, warm, practiced, generous with detail in all the places that made her look good. "I opened my home in 1998, she said. "My husband Ray and we didn't have children of our own, couldn't medically. And we decided early on that we weren't going to spend our lives wishing for something we could just as easily go out and provide for somebody else. 11 children have come through our home since then. 11. Some for a few months, some for years. I like to think I gave every single one of them structure, consistency, a house with rules, because children from hard situations need rules more than anything else. That's not popular to say these days, but it's true. Structure, Marcus repeated. Not a question, just the word, set down flat, like he was placing it somewhere he could come back to later. Yes, Your Honor. Discipline, boundaries. I ran a tight home. And how did you determine what kind of discipline a particular child needed? Diane tilted her head slightly, the way a teacher does when a student asks a question she considers beneath the material. Every child's different, Your Honor. Some needed a gentler hand. Some needed a firmer one. I adjusted based on what I observed. Based on what you observed, Marcus said again, and wrote something down. Grant Pilcher, beside Diane, didn't like the rhythm of this. Judges who repeated phrases back verbatim were building toward something. He leaned toward Diane and murmured for her to keep her answer short. She didn't look at him. I'd like to go through the placements individually, Marcus said, starting with the earliest recorded in your file. A placement beginning in March 2002. Angela Torres flipped through her stack, found the corresponding tab, and slid the page toward the front of her folder, more out of habit than actual need, since she hadn't reviewed it closely enough to remember the specifics. That would have been, Diane said, pausing for the first time, one of my very first placements. A young boy. I don't recall all the details after all these years, Your Honor. It's been over 2 decades. Take your time, Marcus said. I have his intake evaluation in front of me. It notes he arrived underweight, with documented anxiety symptoms, and a caseworker note recommending, quote, consistent positive reinforcement and monitoring for signs of regression. Can you tell me what steps you took to address that? I gave him structure, Diane said. Meals on schedule, chores, a bedtime. Consistency is the best medicine for a child like that. A child like that, Marcus said. It was the first crack. Small. Almost nothing. But Reginald, sitting in the back of the gallery, felt it land in his stomach like a dropped stone, because he recognized the phrase. He'd heard versions of it his whole childhood in that house, not about himself, but about the placements who didn't look like the Halloway's biological extended family. He sat forward slightly. He still had no idea the judge asking these questions was the boy the phrase had once been aimed at. I meant a child who'd had a difficult start, Diane said, recovering, smoothing her tone back into warmth. All children in foster care have had a difficult start, Your Honor. That's rather the definition of the situation. Of course, Marcus said. Let's move to a placement beginning in 2003. Records show the child was withdrawn from school for 11 days that year, listed as homeschooled temporarily due to behavioral concerns. Do you recall the behavioral concerns? I'd have to think back, Diane said. That's 20 years. Take your time, Marcus said again, and this time there was something almost gentle in it, which was somehow worse. Diane felt the temperature of the room shift, though nothing about the lighting or the air had changed. She glanced at Grant. Grant was writing something on his legal pad and not looking up. I believe, Diane said slowly, that particular child was struggling academically, and I felt it was in his best interest to work with him more directly at home for a period. Was the child disciplined during this period at home? Disciplined? How, Your Honor? However you'd like to describe it. Diane's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. I don't recall the specifics of an 11-day period from over 2 decades ago. Understood, Marcus said. Ms. Torres, does the file contain any documentation from that period? Any home visit notes? Angela flipped through pages that felt suddenly thinner than they should have been. There's a gap, Your Honor. I see a scheduled home visit was recorded as completed, but there's no narrative attached. Just a checkbox. A checkbox, Marcus said, and let it sit in the room for 3 full seconds before continuing. We'll come back to that. Ms. Holloway, I want to ask you something more general. In your years fostering, did you ever treat any child differently than another, based on anything other than their individual needs? And there it was. The question that sounded, on its surface, entirely reasonable. The kind of thing any judge might ask in a routine renewal. But Diane felt it land somewhere else entirely, somewhere she'd never had to answer to before, and for the first time in the hearing, her carefully maintained warmth slipped enough that something sharper showed through underneath. Your Honor, with respect, she said, and her voice had an edge on it now, thin but unmistakable. I've fostered 11 children over 25 years. I've been recognized by this county 3 times for excellence in foster parenting. I run a nonprofit that trains new foster families using the exact methods I used in my own home. I don't think it's fair to sit here and imply, based on old checkboxes and gaps in 20-year-old paperwork, that I did anything but everything I could for those kids. I haven't implied anything, Ms. Holloway, Marcus said. I've asked you a question. Then no, Diane said. The answer is no. I treated every child in my home exactly the same. With love. With structure. Ask any of them. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Not angry. Not triumphant. Just looking. The way you look at something you've waited a long time to see, clearly. I intend to, he said. Let's take a 15-minute recess. Ms. Torres, I'd like you to pull the complete file, not the renewal summary, the complete intake and placement file, for case number FC 118834. I believe that's the placement beginning in 2002. Angela blinked. The complete file, Your Honor? That'll take some time to locate. It may be in archive storage. Then we'll take time, Marcus said, and brought the gavel down once, lightly, more punctuation than command. 15 minutes. Diane sat back down slowly. Grant leaned toward her, whispering something urgent. She wasn't listening. She was staring at the number Marcus had just said out loud, FC 118834, turning it over, trying to place it among 11 names, 11 faces, 25 years of a story she had always been the one to tell. She didn't recognize the number. She was about to recognize the boy. The recess room smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet. Angela Torres sat at a folding table in the records annex 2 floors down, a stack of banker's boxes pulled from archive storage in front of her, dust still on her sleeves from digging them out. FC 118834. She'd found the box in 11 minutes, faster than she'd expected, which she registered only distantly, too focused on what she was reading to appreciate the small mercy of it. The file was thin for 6 years of a child's life. That was the first thing that bothered her. Court-mandated home visits were supposed to generate a report every single time, narrative notes, photographs where required, a caseworker's signature. What she found instead was a folder full of shortcuts. Check boxes marked visit completed, no concerns noted, with no accompanying narrative. A gap of 14 months between 2004 and 2005 with no documentation at all. A single handwritten note, unsigned, tucked into the back of the folder, that read, asterisk child reports being made to eat separately from other foster children in home. Caseworker unable to substantiate. Marked as isolated incident, no further action, asterisk. Angela read that line 4 times. No further action. She'd written that phrase herself dozens of times, in dozens of files, over 19 years on the job. It was a phrase you used when you had 11 cases stacked on your desk and a supervisor asking why you were behind. And a single unsubstantiated note from a scared kid wasn't enough to justify the hours it would take to dig deeper. She understood, sitting there, exactly how a caseworker 2 decades ago had made that call. She understood it because she had made calls exactly like it herself. This year, last year, every year she'd had this job. She found something else near the bottom of the folder. A photograph, faded, paperclipped to an intake form. A boy, maybe 8 years old, standing stiff and serious in front of a house she didn't recognize, wearing clothes that looked a size too large. She turned it over. On the back, in pencil, someone had written a name. Marcus. Angela sat very still for a moment. It was a common enough name. It meant nothing yet. But something about the handwriting, about the careful way it was written, like someone trying to make sure a name survived, made her stomach tighten before her brain had caught up to why. She gathered the file and went back upstairs faster than she needed to. Reginald Combs had stepped out into the hallway during the recess to text a friend whose custody hearing he was actually there for, letting them know things were running behind. He leaned against the wall outside for B, phone in hand, and that's where Diane found him. She hadn't planned it. She'd simply walked out for air, and there he was, the boy who'd shared a room with the boy whose case number the judge had just read aloud. Older now. A grown man in a school polo. She almost didn't recognize him until he looked up. "Reginald," she said, and something in her voice reached for the old warmth automatically, like flipping a switch she'd used 1,000 times. "My goodness. Look at you." He straightened up slowly. "Ms. Halloway, are you here for the hearing?" she asked, though she clearly meant something more like, "Are you here because of me?" "No," he said. "Custody case for a friend. I didn't even know this was happening today." He paused. "You look surprised to see me." "I'm just surprised how much time has passed," she said, recovering her smile. "You were such a steady presence in that house. I always said you were the easy one." Reginald felt the words land wrong, the way old bruises ache differently once you understand what caused them. The easy one. He'd heard that phrase before growing up, always delivered like a compliment, and it had taken him years outside that house to understand what it had actually meant. That being easy had been the price of being treated decently. "Do you remember Marcus?" he asked, before he could stop himself. Something crossed Diane's face, brief, almost nothing, gone as quickly as it came. "Of course I remember Marcus," she said. "I remember all of them." "He didn't have it easy in that house," Reginald said. Quiet, not accusing yet, just stating something he'd carried a long time and never had the occasion to say out loud. Diane's smile thinned. "Every child in foster care has a hard road, Reginald. That's not specific to my home." "That's not what I said." "I think," Diane said, her voice cooling several degrees, the warmth retracting like a tide going out, "that you were a child, and children remember things through a child's eyes. I did the best I could for 11 kids with the resources I had. I don't appreciate having that questioned by a room full of strangers over paperwork from 20 years ago." "I'm not a stranger," Reginald said. "I lived it." Diane didn't answer that. The bailiff called that recess was ending, and she turned and walked back into the courtroom without another word, her folio held a little tighter against her side than before. Reginald stood in the hallway a moment longer, his heart going harder than he expected. He thought about texting Marcus right then. "Hey, weird question. Were you ever in the Halloway house court thing today? Long story," but the bailiff called again, and he went back to his seat instead, telling himself he'd ask later. Back in the courtroom, Angela slid the complete file across the evidence table, and Marcus took it without ceremony, the way he took every exhibit, careful, unreadable, professional. He opened it. He found the unsigned note about the child eating separately. He found the 14-month gap. He found, at the very bottom, the photograph. He did not react. It took every year of training he'd built into himself, every hour of composure he'd practiced since law school, since long before law school, since he was 7 years old and learned that reacting only made things worse. To look at his own 8-year-old face and set the photograph down flat on the desk without his hand shaking. "Ms. Torres," he said, and his voice came out exactly as even as it had all afternoon. "Walk the court through what you found." Angela stood. "Your Honor, the file for Case FC 118834 shows a documented pattern of incomplete home visit reporting across a 14-month period, an unsubstantiated but recorded complaint regarding differential treatment of the child in the home, and no follow-up documentation after that complaint was logged." She paused. "In my professional opinion, this file should have been flagged for deeper review at every subsequent renewal cycle. It wasn't." "Why not?" Marcus asked. "Because," Angela said, and to her credit, she didn't look away from the truth of it. "Nobody read past the summary page, including me, 3 times. Diane rose sharply. "Your Honor, I object to this entire line of. This is a licensing hearing, Ms. Holloway, not a trial. There's no jury to perform for." Marcus's voice didn't rise, but something in it sharpened. Just slightly, just enough. "You said, before the recess, that I could ask any of the children in your care about their treatment. I intend to take you at your word." He looked past her, out into the gallery, and for the first time all afternoon, something that might have been the smallest trace of feeling moved behind his eyes. "Is there anyone here today who lived in the Holloway home?" The room went quiet. Diane's lawyer half rose to object to the irregularity of it, and then thought better of it. Sensing something was moving that objections weren't going to stop. Reginald Combs stood up. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice unsteady but clear. "I did. 7 years. And you can ask me. And you can ask." He stopped. He was looking at the bench now, really looking, at the judge's face for the first time all day, instead of just the robe and the title. And something in the set of the jaw, the stillness, the particular way this man held his hands folded in front of him, snapped into place with a force that took his breath. "You can ask Marcus," he finished, quieter now, almost a whisper, staring at the bench like he was seeing a ghost stand up out of the past. Diane turned to follow his gaze, confused, looking for some other Marcus in the room. There was only one. For a moment, nobody in Courtroom for be moved. Diane Holloway followed Reginald's gaze the way you follow a pointing finger without understanding what it's pointing at, sweeping past the gallery, past Angela Torres frozen mid-motion with the file still open in her hands, past her own lawyer, who had gone very still, until there was nowhere left for her eyes to go except up to the bench, to the man in the black robe who had spent the last 90 minutes taking her whole life apart one checkbox at a time. She looked at him, really looked the way Reginald just had. And the room watched something happen to Diane Holloway's face that none of them would ever be able to fully describe afterward, except to say that it was like watching a woman do arithmetic she didn't want to finish. The jaw, the eyes dark, steady, patient in a way that had irritated her all afternoon without her knowing why. A stillness she'd once mistaken, 24 years ago, for a stubborn child refusing to show he was scared. "Marcus," she said. "Just the name. No honorific. No, Your Honor." It came out of her like something falling. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keys, uncertain for the first time all day whether what was happening was still part of the record or something that had slipped outside it. It was still the record. Marcus would make sure of that. "Ms. Holloway," Marcus said, and his voice did not change. That was the thing that undid her most, that even now, even here, he did not raise it, did not let it crack, did not give her the satisfaction of watching him become the frightened boy she remembered. "You asked me to ask any child in your care about their treatment. Mr. Combs has answered. I'd like the record to reflect that I am also able to answer that question, as the subject of case file FC 118834, placed in your home in March 2002 and removed in 2008. Grant Pilcher's pen stopped moving entirely. He looked at Diane. Diane wasn't looking at anyone. "Your Honor," Pilcher said, rising unsteadily. If the court has a personal connection to a party in this matter, doesn't that require recusal?" Marcus said, before he could finish. "Yes. I've already prepared for that question, Mr. Pilcher, because I knew it was coming the moment I requested this docket. I will be recusing myself from any further proceedings in this matter, effective at the conclusion of today's session, and referring the case to Judge Ellen Marsh for continuation. I am disclosing my prior relationship to the petitioner on the record now, in front of both counsel and the gallery, so that nothing about today's proceedings can later be characterized as concealed or improper. He said it the way he said everything, clean, unhurried, like a man reading directions he'd already memorized. Because he had. He'd known this moment might come the day he requested the rotation, and he had built the exit before he ever walked through the door. But, he continued, and here, for the only time that afternoon, something in his tone shifted, not louder, but heavier, the weight of 24 years finally allowed to land in a room built to hold it. Before I recuse, I want the findings from today's hearing entered into the record in full, so that Judge Marsh inherits a complete picture rather than a fresh start. Ms. Torres has testified to a documented, unaddressed complaint of differential treatment. Mr. Combs has testified unprompted that he witnessed conditions in that home he considered worth speaking about publicly 20 years later without being asked. And I am prepared to testify, if this court requires it in a future proceeding, to my own experience in that home between the ages of 7 and 14. Diane finally spoke. Her voice had lost the warmth entirely. Now, what was left underneath, it was something closer to panic, wearing the clothes of indignation. This is completely inappropriate. You can't sit there and use your position to... I haven't ruled on your license today, Ms. Halloway, Marcus said. I'm recusing precisely so that I don't. What I have done is make sure the file that should have been read 20 years ago finally gets read. That's not a judge settling a score. That's a judge doing the one thing his position obligates him to do when he discovers a case has been mishandled. He makes sure it stops being mishandled. He paused. Whatever happens next happens because of what's in that file, not because of who's sitting here. You have no idea what those years were like for me, Diane said, and it came out sharper than she meant it to, some old reflex surfacing under pressure. The same reflex Reginald realized with a cold, sick feeling watching from the gallery that used to surface whenever anyone questioned her in that house. Defensiveness first. Always defensiveness first. I raised 11 children on a foster stipend that barely covered groceries. I gave up. Ms. Halloway, her own lawyer said quietly, a hand on her arm. Please. She stopped. She looked at Marcus one more time, and something in her expression, not remorse, not yet, something closer to the dawning shape of consequence, settled over her face like weather moving in. Marcus looked back at her, steady, composed, giving away nothing, the way he had learned to give away nothing in that very house 24 years ago, except that now the stillness wasn't a defense. It was a verdict, waiting to be handed to someone else to deliver. We'll take a short recess, he said, to the room, not to her. When we resume, Judge Marsh will take the bench for the remainder of these proceedings. Ms. Torres, please ensure the complete file, including today's testimony, is transferred to her chambers before end of day. He brought the gavel down once. In the gallery, Reginald sat with his hands pressed flat against his knees, staring at the man he'd shared a bunk bed with for 7 years, a man he hadn't recognized until the exact second recognition became unavoidable, and felt something in his chest finally loosen after 2 decades of carrying a silence he hadn't known how to put down. Diane Halloway sat at the petitioner's table, her folio still tucked against her side, staring at nothing, doing the arithmetic all over again, arriving each time at the same impossible sum. The boy she had once decided didn't matter enough to feed at the same table as the others had grown up to be the man who just made sure her entire life story would finally be read past the summary page. 3 weeks later, Courtroom 4B looked exactly the same. Same gold bars of afternoon light through unwashed windows. Same banker's boxes stacked along the wall. Same chipped seal behind the bench. But the person behind that bench was different now, and so was the air in the room. Judge Ellen Marsh was 61, silver-haired, with the unhurried precision of someone who had presided over family court for 19 years and had long since stopped being surprised by what people were capable of doing to children in their care. She had read the complete file, All of it, the original intake, the 14-month gap, the unsubstantiated note about separate meals, the sworn statement Marcus Webb had submitted in writing rather than in person, at his own insistence, so that no one could later claim the proceeding turned into spectacle rather than record. She had also read 3 new sworn statements that hadn't existed 3 weeks ago, because once Reginald Combs spoke up in open court, 2 other names from the Holloway file, people Angela Torres, had spent the recess weeks tracking down one by one, had come forward on their own. Diane Holloway sat at the petitioner's table, without her folio this time. Grant Pilcher sat beside her, a different kind of stillness in him now, the stillness of a lawyer who understood the case was no longer winnable, and was simply managing how much of it could be salvaged. "I've reviewed the complete record in this matter," Judge Marsh said, including testimony taken on the previous hearing date, 3 supplemental sworn statements received in the interim, and the full historical case file for FC 11883 along with corresponding files for Ms. Holloway's other 10 foster placements between 1998 and 2019. She turned a page. "I want to be direct about what this hearing is and is not. This is a civil licensing matter, not a criminal proceeding. But the standard for continued licensure as a foster parent in the state of Ohio is not merely the absence of a crime. It is the presence of demonstrated fitness to care for vulnerable children. Based on the record before me, I find that standard is not met." Diane's hands, folded on the table, tightened. "Findings," Judge Marsh continued. 1. The record establishes a documented pattern, across at least 4 of 11 placements, of differential treatment correlated with the race of the child in care, including denial of shared meals, disproportionate use of isolation as discipline, and withdrawal from school under vague or unsubstantiated behavioral justifications that were not applied to other children in the same household during overlapping periods. 2. The record establishes that Ms. Holloway, in her role operating Holloway Family Futures, used training materials and methods drawn directly from practices this court now finds constituted mistreatment, and disseminated those methods to newly licensed foster families across 3 counties. 3. The record establishes that Franklin County Children's Services failed, across 3 prior renewal cycles, to conduct the kind of substantive review that would have identified this pattern earlier, a failure I am addressing separately. She looked up directly at Diane, for the first time since beginning. "Ms. Holloway, effective today, your foster care license is revoked. Permanently. You are not eligible to reapply in this state under any name, corporate structure, or affiliated program." Grant Pilcher didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue with. Additionally, Judge Marsh continued, the state contract funding Holloway Family Futures training program, approximately $340,000 annually, is suspended effective immediately. Pending the outcome of a formal misconduct investigation, I am ordering the Department of Job and Family Services to open, covering all 11 of your prior placements, not merely the one raised in this proceeding. Diane's breath went shallow. Her nonprofit, the training center, the plaques. The court further orders a financial review of stipend payments received in connection with claimed special needs adjustments for placements where no corresponding documentation exists in the file, specifically placements in 2004, 2007, and 2011. Preliminary review by Ms. Torres's office suggests those claims may total in excess of $60,000 in overpayment across those years, subject to full audit. If confirmed, repayment will be ordered as part of the misconduct proceeding. Diane's lawyer finally spoke, his voice careful. "Your Honor, my client would ask the court to consider the totality of her service. 11 children, 25 years. I have considered the totality," Judge Marsh said. "The totality includes the 25 years. It also includes the pattern this court has just found. Both are part of the same record, Mr. Pilcher. I don't get to weigh one against the other and pretend the second disappears because the first is longer." She turned to Angela Torres, seated at the caseworker's table, who had not looked up from her legal pad in several minutes. "Ms. Torres, I want to be equally direct with your office. This file should have been substantively reviewed at minimum 3 renewal cycles ago. I'm not suggesting malice. I'm suggesting a systemic failure of diligence that this court takes seriously, Because the whole point of a renewal review is to catch exactly this kind of pattern before it reaches its 12th year, not its 25th. I'm ordering Franklin County Children's Services to place you on a formal performance improvement plan effective this month, with a full audit of your remaining caseload for similar gaps in documentation. Angela nodded once, her jaw tight, and said quietly, "Understood, Your Honor. I'll cooperate fully." "I know you will," Judge Marsh said, and something in her voice softened by exactly 1 degree, not forgiveness, but the acknowledgement that Angela, at least, hadn't tried to hide from any of it once it surfaced. Judge Marsh closed the file in front of her. "One final matter. I want the record to reflect that this case reached this court's attention through highly unusual circumstances. Specifically, the presiding judge on the original hearing date disclosed a prior personal history with the petitioner and recused himself appropriately on the record before any ruling was made. I want to be unambiguous. No finding in this order rests on that judge's personal history. Every finding rests on documentary evidence and sworn testimony independently obtained after his recusal. I make that clear so that nothing in this ruling can be characterized now or later as anything other than what it is, a licensing decision based on a complete record that should have been read years ago." She brought the gavel down. "This hearing is concluded. Ms. Holloway, you have 30 days to appeal this order through standard channels, though I'll note for the record that an appeal will require you to contest specific factual findings, not simply the outcome you prefer." Outside the courthouse, on the wide limestone steps, Diane stood alone for a long moment while Grant Pilcher took a phone call 20 feet away, already fielding questions from a local reporter who'd caught wind of the hearing from a court clerk. She looked down toward Broad Street at the ordinary traffic moving through an ordinary Tuesday afternoon and thought about the plaques in her office, 3 years running Franklin County Foster Parent of Excellence, and wondered, for the first time in 25 years, whether any of it had ever meant what she told herself it meant. Inside, in his chambers 3 floors up, Marcus Webb sat behind his desk with the door closed. His robe already hung on its hook, and allowed himself, for exactly 1 minute, to put his elbows on the desk and his face in his hands. Not to cry. He didn't, not for this. Just to breathe, once all the way down, the way he hadn't let himself breathe in a courtroom in 11 months on the bench. Then he sat up, straightened his collar, and picked up the next file on his desk, an ordinary custody matter, nothing to do with Diane Holloway at all, because there were other children in other files who needed the same thing he had just made sure Diane Holloway's file finally received. Someone reading past the summary page. The story broke locally first, a 3-paragraph item in the Columbus Dispatch about a foster license revocation tied to a recusal irregularity, written by a reporter who didn't yet understand what he'd stumbled onto. By the end of that week, it wasn't local anymore. 2 more names came forward within 9 days of the ruling. The first was a woman named Patricia Owens, 36, living in Dayton now, who had been placed with the Halloways for 18 months in 2001, before Marcus arrived. She called Angela Torres's office directly after seeing the news item, her voice shaking on the recording Angela made with her permission. "I thought it was just me," she said. "I thought I did something to deserve it. I've spent 20 years thinking I did something." The second was a man named Curtis Reyes, 44, who had been in the Holloway home for barely 4 months in 1999 before being moved to another placement, a move his old case file described only as family request, unspecified. He remembered the reason clearly. He'd finally said it out loud to a caseworker for the first time in his life, 25 years after the fact. Diane had told him she didn't have room for another one like him, in a house that, according to the same year's records, still had 2 open beds. Angela Torres compiled both statements herself, working long nights that her supervisor now actually noticed, because the performance improvement plan had come with something Angela hadn't expected. Real oversight. Someone finally reading what she turned in. She found she didn't resent it the way she thought she would. She'd spent 19 years assuming thoroughness was a luxury the caseload didn't allow. She was starting to understand it had never been optional. It had just been skipped. The Department of Job and Family Services opened its formal misconduct investigation in the second week of the following month, covering, per Judge Marsh's order, all 11 of Diane Holloway's prior placements. Investigators pulled school records, medical records, and neighbor statements going back over 2 decades. A pattern that had lived unexamined in a stack of banker's boxes for 25 years was now being assembled page by page into something that could no longer be filed under no further action. Holloway Family Future's state training contract was formally terminated at the end of that month. The $340,000 in annual funding, money that had paid for the training center's lease, 2 staff salaries, and a curriculum built directly from Diane's own methods, was reallocated within the fiscal quarter to an independent oversight program the county was still finalizing. The training center closed its doors on a Friday afternoon with a notice taped to the glass door that said simply, "Closed. Contact county for referrals." The civil suit came in October. Patricia Owens and Curtis Reyes filed jointly, represented by a firm in Columbus that specialized in institutional abuse cases, seeking damages for emotional distress, and in Curtis's case, for lost wages tied to years of documented anxiety treatment he could trace directly back to his placement. Reginald Combs was deposed as a witness, not a plaintiff. He didn't want money. He told Angela plainly. He just wanted the record straight. Marcus, still recused from any judicial role in the matter, submitted a formal statement through counsel. Careful, factual, stripped of anything that could be read as advocacy, because he understood better than anyone in that building the difference between telling the truth and using a bench to settle it. The financial audit, meanwhile, moved slower and found more than expected. The special needs adjustment stipends Judge Marsh had flagged turned out to span not 3 years, but 7, spread across 4 different placements, totaling just over $61,000 in payments tied to diagnoses that either didn't exist in any medical record or had been resolved years before the adjustment claims continued. The state ordered repayment in full, structured over a payment plan. Diane's remaining assets could barely support once her nonprofit's assets were frozen pending investigation. At Grace Community Church in Groveport, where Diane had sat on the missions committee for 11 years and led the annual coat drive every November, the whispers started slow and then didn't stop. She stopped attending the second Sunday after the story ran statewide. Nobody called to ask why. That silence told her everything the story hadn't. The Groveport Rotary Club quietly removed her name from its Community Champions wall, a plaque she'd been given 3 years running, now sitting in a drawer somewhere, waiting for someone to decide what to do with it. Her neighbors, people who had waved to her in driveways for 2 decades, began finding reasons to be inside when she walked past. Diane sat in her kitchen most evenings that autumn, the training center's closure notice folded in a drawer she didn't open, watching the local news coverage of a story that used her name and photo more often than she could stand, and slowly came to understand that the 11 children she had always described as the proof of her goodness had become, instead, the record of everything she'd refused to see. She had one piece of paper on her kitchen table that she read more than any other. It was a letter from her own lawyer, informing her that Marcus Webb, Judge Webb, the letter specified, out of some formality Grant Pilcher couldn't quite let go of, had requested, through proper channels, a single meeting. Not a deposition, not testimony, a meeting off the record, at his discretion, if she was willing. She sat with that letter for 4 days before she called Grant back and said yes. They met in a small conference room at the county administration building, chosen deliberately by Marcus because it was neutral ground. Not his chambers, not her lawyer's office, not anywhere that belonged more to one of them than the other. A folding table, 2 chairs on each side, a window looking out onto a parking lot instead of anything worth looking at. Marcus had asked that no one else be present except a court reporter he'd arranged privately, at his own request, so there's a record of what's said, in case it's ever needed, by either of us. Diane arrived first. She dressed carefully, the way she always did, though for the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't sure what impression she was dressing for. She sat with her hands folded on the table and waited, and when the door opened and Marcus walked in, not robed now, just a gray suit, his face as unreadable as it had been on the bench, something in her chest tightened in a way she hadn't expected. He sat across from her. He didn't offer his hand. Neither did she. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I wasn't sure I should," Diane said. My lawyer told me not to say anything that could be used. This isn't a deposition, Marcus said. Nothing here changes your case. I have no role in it anymore. I asked to see you because I thought you should have the chance to say something to me directly, if you wanted to. Not to a courtroom. Not to a reporter. To me. Diane was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was smaller than the one she'd used in that courtroom 3 months ago. Smaller than the one she'd used at church potlucks for 25 years. I don't know how to start, she said. Start wherever you want. She took a breath. I've spent every night since that hearing going back through everything. All 11 of you. And I keep telling myself I loved you kids. I keep telling myself that, and some part of me still believes it. And I don't know what to do with the fact that I can believe that and also be the person that file describes. She looked at her hands. I was harder on you than I was on the others. I know that now. I think some part of me always knew it and called it something else. Structure. Discipline. I told myself I was preparing you for a world that would be harder on you than it was on them. And maybe I even believed that too. But I can't tell anymore what was protecting you and what was just. She stopped. Just what? Marcus asked. Not sharp. Just steady. The way he'd been steady in every conversation with her his whole life, even when he was 7 years old and had no words yet for what steadiness cost him. Prejudice, Diane said, and the word seemed to cost her something physical to say. I don't know how else to say it. I'm 60 years old, and I'm sitting here saying a word about myself I would have argued with anyone who used it about me a year ago. I'm ashamed of it. I am. But I need you to know, I never once in 25 years thought of myself as someone who could do what that file says I did. That's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse. I just don't know what else to give you except that it's true. And I'm sorry. I am so sorry, Marcus. Marcus sat with that for a long moment. He didn't rush to fill the silence, and he didn't let it stretch so long that it became cruel. I believe you're sorry, he said finally. I don't doubt that some part of what you're telling me right now is real. I want you to know that, because I think you need to hear it, and I don't say things I don't mean. He paused. But I need you to understand something else, and I need you to hear it exactly the way I mean it. This isn't about one moment. It was never about one meal you made me eat alone, or one time you pulled me out of school, or one comment about structure. It was a pattern, sustained across 6 years of my childhood, and repeated, I've since learned, across at least 3 other children's childhoods before and after mine. An apology can be sincere and still not be enough to undo a pattern. Both of those things are true at the same time. I know, Diane said quietly. I'm not here to tell you whether you're forgiven, Marcus said. That's not a legal question, and I'm not sure it's mine to answer, honestly, even personally. What I can tell you is this: I don't hate you. I spent a long time as an adult being angry, and I did the work to move past carrying that anger every day because it was making my life smaller, not yours. But moving past the anger isn't the same as pretending the pattern didn't happen, or that one conversation in a conference room settles what 25 years and 11 children created. I understand what you're telling me. I don't reject it. But this isn't about one moment. It's a pattern. And I think the only honest thing either of us can do right now is let that be true without rushing past it to make either of us feel better. Diane nodded slowly, tears finally slipping down, quiet, no performance in them at all. The first tears in that building in months that weren't for an audience, because there was no audience left. What do I do now, she asked, with whatever's left of my life? I don't know how to be a person who did this and also keep living. Marcus considered the question carefully, the way he considered everything. I don't know either, he said honestly. That's not my question to answer for you. But I'll tell you what I'm doing with mine, since you asked. I'm not spending it trying to make you pay forever. I'm spending it making sure the next kid in a house like yours gets seen sooner than I did. That's the only part of this I actually have control over. He stood. I hope you find something real to do with what's left of yours. I mean that. But I'm not going to pretend today changes what happened, and I don't think you should ask me to. Diane looked up at him. This man who had once been a boy in her home, quiet and watchful and careful never to show her anything she could use against him, and understood, with a clarity that arrived 25 years too late, that his stillness had never once been weakness. "Thank you for coming today," Marcus said, and left the room without waiting for a response, because he had already said everything he'd come to say. The Franklin County Foster Placement Oversight Initiative launched 8 months after Diane Holloway's license was revoked, in a conference room considerably less grand than any courtroom. Folding chairs, a borrowed projector, coffee in a dented urn from the county facilities office. Marcus Webb had not designed it alone, and he was careful in every meeting to make sure that facts stayed visible. He'd brought in Angela Torres, whose performance improvement plan had, by then, turned into something closer to a promotion. She was named the program's first lead caseworker, a role she'd requested herself once she understood what it would actually let her do. He'd brought in 2 retired family court judges, a child psychologist who specialized in complex trauma, and after some hesitation on both sides, Reginald Combs, who had spent the months since the hearing thinking hard about what he wanted to do with the anger he'd finally been allowed to feel. The program's core idea was simple, almost embarrassingly so, which was exactly why nobody had built it sooner. Every foster placement renewal for every family in the county would now require a substantive narrative review, not a checkbox, not a summary page, an actual read-through of the complete file by a second, independent caseworker every single cycle, cross-referenced against school attendance records, medical visit patterns, and any prior complaints, however minor or unsubstantiated. They'd been marked at the time. Complaints that had once been filed as isolated, no further action, would now be flagged automatically for review if a second complaint from any source arrived in a later cycle, closing the exact gap that had let Diane Holloway's file sit untouched for 25 years. "It's not glamorous," Angela said at the launch meeting, to a room of caseworkers who looked, understandably, like people being handed more work with no additional pay. "I know that. I'm one of you. I signed off on that file 3 times without reading past page 1, and I've had to live with what that cost. This isn't about catching bad people around every corner. It's about making sure the next kid doesn't wait 25 years to be read." Marcus didn't speak much at that first meeting. He sat near the back in a folding chair like everyone else, and let Angela and the psychologist carry it, because he had understood from the very beginning, that if this program became known as the Judge's Initiative, it would collapse the moment he moved to another docket or another courthouse. He wanted it built into the county structure, not into his own name. Reginald took a different kind of role. He became a volunteer liaison, someone caseworkers could send a child to talk to who wasn't a psychologist or an official, just a grown man who'd been a foster kid himself and had sat in that exact chair, at that exact age, wondering if anyone would ever read his file the way it deserved to be read. He started running a Saturday group at the Groveport Community Center for teenagers currently in foster placements, nothing formal, just pizza, and a room where kids could say true things without worrying an adult would write it down as an isolated incident. By spring, the numbers had already started to shift. 14 renewal cases flagged for deeper review that would have sailed through under the old summary page system. 3 of those 14 led to substantive corrective plans for the foster families involved, additional training, mandated home visit frequency increases, 1 voluntary license surrender before it became involuntary. None as severe as Diane's case. That was, in its own way, the point. The program wasn't built to produce more dramatic revocations. It was built so a pattern could be caught at year 3 instead of year 25 quietly, before it calcified into something a courtroom eventually had to unmake in public. Time moved the way it does, not in dramatic leaps, but in the accumulation of ordinary Tuesdays. A year passed. Then, most of another. Marcus was moved to a different docket rotation, as judges routinely are, and the oversight program kept running without him. Staffed now by 3 full-time caseworkers and a standing budget line the county commission had approved with almost no debate, because by then the story of how it started had traveled far enough that resisting it publicly would have cost more than funding it. Patricia Owens and Curtis Reyes settled their civil suit that same year, an amount neither of them discussed publicly, though Curtis used part of his to finally finish the psychology degree he'd started twice and abandoned twice, once because of anxiety he could now trace, with documentation, back to a house in Groveport. Diane Holloway, for her part, disappeared from public life almost entirely, No more plaques, no more potlucks, a name that came up in county records occasionally in connection with her repayment plan and otherwise nowhere at all. Marcus heard secondhand, through Grant Pilcher's office filing routine compliance updates, that she'd taken a part-time job at a fabric store 2 towns over. He didn't feel triumphant when he heard it. He didn't feel much of anything, which surprised him more than either feeling would have. One evening that spring, Reginald called him, not about the program, just to talk, the way they still did every few months. Old habit, surviving new distance. "You should come by the Saturday group sometime," Reginald said. "Not to speak or anything. Just to be in the room. There's a kid in there right now, 13, quiet like you used to be. Doesn't say much. But last week she told me something, and I actually believed she felt safe enough to be wrong about it, if she wanted to. That's new. That didn't used to happen in that room." Marcus was quiet for a second on the other end of the line. "I'll come," he said. 2 years after the ruling, the Groveport Community Center's Saturday group had outgrown its original room. What started as Reginald and 4 teenagers around a folding table with 2 pizza boxes had become 16 kids most weeks, spilling into the gymnasium annex because the county, once it saw attendance numbers, had finally allocated space that fit. There was a bulletin board now, covered in photos and handwritten notes kids had pinned up themselves. Nothing official, nothing filed. Just proof that they'd been somewhere that remembered them week to week. Marcus came on a Saturday in late April, exactly as he'd told Reginald he would, though it had taken him 2 years to actually follow through, not out of reluctance, but because judges' calendars had a way of eating good intentions, and because some part of him had needed the distance before he was ready to walk back into a room that would remind him, even loosely, of the one he'd grown up in. He sat in the back, the way he had at the oversight program's first meeting, not to be noticed. Reginald introduced him only as a friend, and most of the kids didn't clock the name, didn't connect a man in a plain jacket eating pizza in the corner to anything they might have half heard about on local news 2 years earlier. That was fine. That was, in fact, exactly how Marcus preferred it. It was a girl named Destiny, 13, quiet, the one Reginald had mentioned on the phone, who ended up talking to Marcus longest, not because either of them intended it, but because she sat down next to him with a paper plate and started talking about a book she was reading. And he listened the way he listened to everything, fully, without hurrying her toward a point. "Reginald said you used to be in care too," she said eventually, not quite a question. "A long time ago," Marcus said. "Was it bad?" "Some of it, not all of it." He considered how much more to say and decided, for a 13-year-old he'd just met, that honesty mattered more than comfort. "The bad part stayed hidden a long time. Nobody read the file close enough to catch it until I was grown." Destiny nodded slowly, like that tracked with something she already suspected about how the world worked. "Reginald reads everything," she said. "Like, actually reads it, not just nodding." "That matters more than people think," Marcus said. Later, after most of the kids had drifted out and the gym had gone quiet except for the hum of the vending machine, Reginald sat down across from Marcus with 2 paper cups of bad coffee and didn't say anything for a while, just letting the room settle. "I want to tell you something," Reginald said finally, "and I want you to actually hear it, not just take it as me being nice." Marcus waited. "When you first walked in today, before anybody knew who you were, I watched 3 different kids come talk to you without being told to. Destiny doesn't do that. She didn't do that with the psychologist the county sent last fall. She did it with you because something about how you sit in a room makes it feel like it's safe to be quiet around you." Reginald turned his cup slowly on the table. "I've been doing this 2 years now, every Saturday. And I want to tell you, honestly, not as your friend, but as somebody who lived in that house and has spent 20 years wondering if anything about it could ever mean something other than what it meant to us. It's different now. The kids in this county who go into care, the ones who get flagged in that oversight system Angela runs, I've talked to caseworkers who tell me flat out they catch things now they'd have missed 5 years ago. Not because people got smarter. Because somebody finally built a system where reading the whole file isn't optional. That's Angela's program," Marcus said. "Not mine." "It's both of yours," Reginald said, without hesitation. "And I'm not saying that to flatter you. I'm saying it because I watched it happen. I watched a system that let a woman hurt 4 kids for 25 years without anybody catching it turn into a system that flagged 14 cases in its first year that would have sailed through before. That's not nothing, Marcus. That's not small. That's the actual thing you always said you wanted, not to punish her forever, but to make sure the next kid didn't wait as long as we did. Marcus looked down at his coffee for a moment. He didn't often let himself sit in a feeling this directly. But here, in an empty gym on a Saturday evening, with no bench and no robe and no record being kept, he let it land. I still think about the file sitting in that box for 25 years, he said quietly. Nobody opened it. Nobody had to. Nobody was made to. I know, Reginald said. But somebody finally did. And because of that, Destiny's file gets opened every year, whether anything looks wrong or not. That's the whole difference. That's the entire thing that changed. Marcus nodded slowly, and for the first time since the hearing 2 years earlier, something in his chest that had been braced quietly for a very long time allowed itself to loosen. Same time next Saturday? Reginald asked. Same time, Marcus said. 3 years after the ruling, the Franklin County Foster Placement Oversight Initiative stopped being something people in the building called the pilot program and started being something the state legislature actually looked at. A staffer from the Ohio Department of Job and Family Services attended one of Angela Torres's quarterly review sessions, sat quietly in the back with a legal pad, and left with enough notes to write a memo that made its way, eventually, to a subcommittee hearing in Columbus about statewide foster licensing reform. Angela was asked to testify. She stood in front of legislators in a hearing room considerably grander than any conference room in the county building, and she told them, plainly, what she told that first room of caseworkers years earlier, that the failure hadn't been one bad actor slipping through. It had been an entire system built to reward speed over thoroughness, and that the fix wasn't punishing caseworkers for being human. It was building a structure that didn't require any single overworked person to catch. Everything alone. 2 other counties adopted versions of the model within the year, Cuyahoga first, then Montgomery. Neither called it the Holloway case out loud, not officially, though everyone in the room during those early planning meetings knew exactly where the blueprint had come from. Angela kept a printed copy of the original case file in a locked drawer in her office, not to display, not to punish herself with, but as a kind of anchor, proof of exactly what happens when nobody reads past the summary page, kept close enough that she'd never let herself forget it again. Reginald's Saturday group became formally a county-recognized peer support program, with 2 paid part-time coordinators and a waiting list. Destiny, the quiet 13-year-old, aged out of foster care 4 years later, having never once, in that time, had a renewal cycle pass without a full narrative review. She wrote Reginald a card the week she left for community college that he kept pinned to the bulletin board in the gym annex, right where the other kids could see it, because he wanted them to see that leaving that room could look like something other than disappearing. Diane Holloway's name surfaced one more time, 2 years after their conference room meeting, in a brief follow-up news item about the completion of her repayment plan, a small piece for paragraphs, buried in the local section. She had, by then, moved out of Groveport entirely, to a smaller town an hour north, where nobody knew her name well enough to whisper it. Marcus read the item once quietly in his chambers and felt nothing sharp when he read it. Not satisfaction, not grief, just the flat, settled recognition of a chapter that had finally, genuinely closed, on terms that were fair rather than merciful, which was the only kind of ending he'd ever actually asked for. Marcus Webb was appointed to the Ohio Court of Appeals the following spring, a routine elevation on paper, the kind of career step that appeared in a 2-line announcement in the Bar Association newsletter and nowhere else. He kept one thing from his old chambers when he moved offices, the photograph from Case File FC 118834, the one of an 8-year-old boy standing stiff in front of a house he didn't recognize anymore, clothes a size too large. He didn't display it. He kept it in a desk drawer, the way Angela kept her copy of the file, close enough to remember, far enough not to live inside. On a Saturday that fall, back at the community center for one of his now regular visits, a new caseworker, young, barely a year into the job, asked him, a little starstruck, a little unsure how to phrase it, What advice he'd give someone just starting out in a system that had failed him as a child. Marcus thought about it for a long moment before he answered. The way he thought about everything. "Read the whole file," he said. "Not the summary. The whole thing. Every time. Because somewhere in this county right now, there's a kid whose entire future depends on somebody finally doing that."